question that we need to ask before any other for our students is, how are you all doing? And it's a question that we've been asking our current students and our future students. And it's a question we're going to continue to ask even as we get into the evaluation of students' applications next year. This is a time when instruction has been turned on its head and students have been asked to adapt in ways that they've never been asked to adapt before. And so I obviously can speak only for my institution, but I imagine a lot of other places would show a tremendous amount of flexibility as we review files next year, no matter the selectivity level of the college, because it's nothing we have seen before. We came out with an announcement week before last saying that if high schools or school districts choose to move to a pass, no credit, or pass fail, or whatever the nomenclature is, grading system, that we would still evaluate that contextually. We're going to understand that students, in most cases, didn't have the option of whether they were going to go pass fail or not. So it wouldn't make sense for us to penalize students for decisions that were made that were beyond their control. The other thing I've been pondering a lot lately is, what about students who may already struggle in some way? They've got learning differences of one kind or another, and now we're asking them to completely change what rhythm they may have been able to get into. And I think colleges are going to be forgiving in ways that perhaps parents and students don't even realize yet. So I would say we're all going to take a deep breath here, and we're going to make sure that we're painting students in the best light possible.
Thank you. John and John, anything to add there?
The only thing I would add is, you know, for a lot of us, we have students that come from a number of different backgrounds, and we have no way to know the resources that are available for those students in terms of internet access and the ability to, you know, whether it's you have a laptop, you don't have a laptop, you're working from an iPhone, you know, all of those things, along with the support that they have at home. You know, I can see it in my own family. I have 2 school-age children. I have a wife who's also a teacher, and trying to manage all of that. And I'm lucky in that I get to come to my office every day. So I don't necessarily, I'm not around the 9 to 5-ish kind of things that are going on, but I know it's been a challenge for my wife to just keep them on track. And so, you know, I think that we're going to go into this next year in terms of looking at students and being as flexible as possible when we're looking at and evaluating those students, and understanding that no one experience is going to be the same as anybody else. Yes, we all went to remote learning, but how students learn remotely is going to be a very individual experience for them.
Yeah, I think you guys are right on target. I think all institutions, including where I am at Davidson, feel the same. We understand that this is not an opportune environment for any student, really. But I think there's other things that, just to kind of give everyone a peace of mind, that when you do an application review process, there's going to be other bits of information that we can get. So knowing when most of the closures happen, you still have the opportunity to submit the mid-year grades for students that are juniors right now. And this is definitely going to be for the next 3 classes that we see coming through. And we want to be as understanding of that as possible. And I think that's where the opportunity for the student in their additional information section of the application, or in their essays and recommendations, just to tell us how this impacted them, so that we can really have that context, and just knowing that we're in the same boat with you all, and we really want to be a resource, and no student is going to be penalized for the current situation and when things are out of their control.
Great, thank you. Well, good segue. Another thing that's been out of control has been standardized testing for a lot of students. Here in North Carolina, our students take the ACT in school, and did that in February just before school closed. So many of our juniors will at least have that test score to report. But if students don't have test scores, and I know that at least in your case at Davidson, John, and at TCU Heath, you have decided to go test score optional. So in the absence of test scores, how will you evaluate students? And that ties in, I think, a bit to what, John, you were just saying about the context and other bits of information you will gather. But can you either elaborate on that as well, how you'll determine without those numbers how to decide about a student?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be different per institution. The last institution I was at prior to joining Davidson was just in the process of going test optional for this current year. And I think it was a different time to do that because you knew you could ask for additional documents and things of that nature. I think in our review process, we do ask for a fair amount of information. So we're already collecting 4 letters of recommendation. You have 2 essays, including the supplement and the application essay itself. There's a lot for us to work with there. And we already know that even prior to the test date cancellations, the test scores are not opportune for a lot of students across the board. So it was really the right time for us to make this decision. Obviously, COVID-19 sped up that process on our end, but we'll definitely be looking even more closely than we do now at the recommendations, the essay sections, and just trying to gather as much information as we can. I do think it's going to be interesting as we get through this cycle to see if the comparisons year over year are still the same, because prior to this point, even test optional institutions, the large percentage of students that apply still submitted test scores. So we want students to know that if you think your scores, if you have them, will help, you can submit those, but do not feel obligated to do so because we will be able to gather enough information and really get to know the students through the process, because we are a smaller institution than you two guys. So our application volume is large for us, but it's also not over 15,000 applications to get through. So we can definitely take that time to look at those pieces we're already asking for in the admission process.
Yeah, our decision to go test optional for next year, I think, was a pretty simple one, actually. As John alluded to, the coronavirus was a catalyst for a conversation that we were likely beginning to have anyway. The impact of standardized tests seems to be outsized in this country. That is, there is some but limited predictive value, and much of what you can learn by looking at a student's test score, you can find elsewhere in the application, most notably a student's transcript. That despite the fact that students come from varying grading systems and school districts and independent schools and so forth, the grades are still a really good predictor of how a student is going to fare in college. And so when we're looking at an application, we're breaking it up basically into an assessment of students' likelihood to succeed academically and how a student can fare on our campus in a co-curricular way, and what kind of character elements the student brings to our community. I don't think that is in any way diminished by the absence of test scores. Of course, we'll still take them, as John said, and I think a lot of folks will still have them. But at this point in time, when the spring exams have been canceled, and as important, we don't know yet when everything is going to be back up and running. It would be one thing if we knew, okay, on a certain date, everyone would be able to take the test. And then once we get to a point when tests are going to be available, how equitable will it be? Will students from rural communities be able to take it in ways that students in suburban affluent communities could take the exam? And because we had no faith that the College Board and the ACT would be able to administer these exams in an equitable way, it was really easy for us to make the decision to suspend the requirement for next year. We didn't go the step that some colleges did, which is to say, we're going to go test optional immediately, or we're going to do it on a 3-year trial basis, like some schools have said. And that's because of how governance works on college campuses. We felt like if we wanted to take that step, we'd have to go through a series of conversations with academic leaders on campus, and it would take some time. And the expediency required in this situation, when everyone is really concerned about what's going to happen right now, if you're a high school junior, you need to know what's the policy going to be? We felt like we can suspend for next year, and then over the course of the next year, have a conversation about what we might do long term. But the bottom line is, we think we're still going to be able to fairly evaluate students in a review of their application, and that for students, as John said, who feel like their scores do reflect, they have had a chance to take the exam and the scores do reflect their ability, we'll still use them in our evaluation.
Great. Okay. That's great. That was a big follow-up, was if I do have scores and my scores are good, I would still like to get credit for those. And so I think I'm hearing from all of you that still send them if you think that that's going to add value to your overall.
Yes.
And John Westover, how about you? Because test scores are still going to be part of this process for NC State. And so let's talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Sure. And as Kim mentioned, that the vast majority of juniors that attend public schools in North Carolina took the ACT in February of this year. So they'll have a score available to them. The other part of this is that NC State simply can't act on its own, and that we're a part of a larger North Carolina state system that includes 17 colleges and universities. What our system did do, though, was change the minimum academic standards that make students generally admissible to any of the institutions throughout the system. And so the new minimums that were approved, and it was in light of COVID-19 and some of the concerns, and to be honest, some of the concerns that, state institutions had here of students applying for fall 2020 that maybe needed to retake the exam to get up to a certain level. What used to be an and statement of a minimum GPA and test score is now an or statement. So it's a 2.5 weighted GPA through the way that the public schools here in North Carolina weight, or an SAT of a 1010 or an ACT composite of 19. And so that was the system's response, knowing that as a state, we had paid for the vast majority of at least public K through 12 students to have taken the ACT in February. What I would say, though, is the further we get into this and the further we get into the summer, if it's looking like there will not be the same availability of testing in August and September and throughout the fall, then we will absolutely have to look again at that particular policy. I honestly don't think that anyone will forget what we're going through right now. And so even though we're going to continue to require scores, we've already had discussions on our campus that those scores are just not going to be the same as what we've had in the past. When a student has had the ability to take the exam multiple times, they will typically do better that second or third time around. The ACT had announced the option of this coming fall where they could take, only certain sections. And so that was going to be a new thing that we'd have to look at as well. So, we review applications holistically, as do my colleagues, John and Heath. And so it'll be one part. It certainly will not be a huge emphasis on the test scores. And it really hasn't been, as Heath said, the curriculum and the record that students write throughout those 3.5 years will be important to us. Again, we're going to be looking at that next year differently as well, knowing that, the junior year and the classes that students have taken and maybe the grades that we see will not necessarily be the same that we're used to. And it'll be interesting for public schools to think about what could be most helpful to their students. And I'm sure the college application process is not what drives how they generate transcripts and what those look like, but they did have 3/4 of grades, or at least a semester plus of graded work before this happened. If there's any way that those grades could still be part of our review process, I think that would be helpful instead of just simply having a year of, pass, no credit, or whatever that is. If that's what we end up with, a year of just pass or no credit, then we'll figure out how to work around that and work with that. But ideally, if there was some way to get a sense, particularly for the junior class, of how they were doing going into this in terms of middle March, that would be helpful.
Okay, that's great. These two questions have come up in chat and sort of relate, so I'm going to stay on this topic for a minute. This one is for you, John Westover, specifically, knowing that NC State has traditionally also had some reading by college and major and things like that. Is there a minimum standard now for GPA or test scores for engineering specifically?
So no, and we try to stay away from that only because, different colleges are looking at students differently. And for us, engineering is such a huge part of our applicant pool that even to give averages, it's so heavily skewed by students that are being admitted to engineering that tend to be the students that do have some of the strongest standardized test scores. And so, for a student applying to engineering versus a student applying to political science, they're looked at very differently in our pool and what those expectations are. So, I don't really want to talk about or say that there's specifically minimums. But what I would say is, we're going to know and recognize that these students did not have the opportunity to take the SAT or ACT at the end of their junior year, which is usually one of the first times that school administered ACT. We see varying degrees of success on that. Some students going into it with zero preparation whatsoever. And so sometimes their scoring on those exams isn't really a good indicator of what they're going to do or how they're going to fare once they've spent more time looking at and working with the SAT or ACT. So I just think that students need to put together the strongest application they can, but we're going to look at things very differently for the fall of 21 class than we have in the past.
Okay. Well, this next one sort of ties into that specifically in terms of the minimums and how closely we're going to look at students. So if you have applications from students who test well and thus received high scores on their first SAT or ACT, will they get a closer look than those students who did not? That's also specific. It's directed at you, John Westover, in terms of our, our state system, because I think the impression is that these minimums aren't going to impact you and Chapel Hill as much as some of the other schools in the system. And
yeah, and so, if a student scores really well on a test score, great. Everything that we look at is within context. So the context of the environment that the student comes from, the context of the educational system that they're in, and the opportunities that are available to them. And so, testing for a student, maybe from Mecklenburg County could be looked at very differently than some of our rural communities here in North Carolina. And so, it's evaluating the student and the circumstances that they're in more so than anything else.
All right. Along testing lines, AP is undergoing some shifts and changes, as well as IB. I know I have several folks on the call whose students are IB students as well. But with AP, what are you all thinking about credits giving these abbreviated exams, if those are even discussions that we can have openly at this point? But I know I'm certainly getting a lot of questions from students trying to determine should they even take a stab at it at this point or not with the change in APs.
We actually at Davidson just heard back from our faculty on Friday right before 5 o'clock. But we had been pushing to get a decision from them, because that's going to be an institutional-based decision everywhere, and it's also going to involve not just the faculty but the registrar, as well as on those incoming credits. So we are deciding to stick with our current policy. So same thing as it would have been last year. If the student took the normal AP exam and got the required score, they will receive credit as well this year if they take the abbreviated exam.
Yeah, we had a conversation with our academic deans last week and arrived at the same conclusion that Davidson did. And it was a really tough decision, because what we're trying to do is balance the idea of exam integrity with flexibility for our students. On the one hand, it feels like a watered down version, right? It's 45 minutes. It's not covering the material on the entire course. It's only going through a portion of it. And yet we have students who've worked their tails off all year, and they've been planning to take these tests so that they could get credit that can either give them advanced standing or allow them to graduate college early. And so we felt that in the end, the scales tipped in favor of flexibility toward the student. And we also we also realized that this doesn't just impact high school seniors who are thinking about, am I going to choose this college next year based on whether or not they're going to take credit, these exam credits, but also juniors, sophomores, and in some cases, high school freshmen who have chosen to take AP classes and want to sit for the exam. So that's where we landed on this. We're going to indeed, as Davidson has decided, keep our policy in place.
Great.
So NC State's going to keep our policy the same as well. The advice I'd give students, though, is to realistically think about your AP experience, and do you feel you've finished, not necessarily finished the course, but you don't want to take an exam, get a score that qualifies you to be in a next level course, and then not feel prepared for that course? Because really that's just going to have an impact on your academic career at the institution that you're starting at. So just to have a frank discussion with yourself as to, did I get to where I think I needed to be at the end of AP Calc or chemistry or whatever it might be to take on that next level course?
John, that's a great point. And I should have mentioned that what we decided was we're going to make that conversation a required part of any communication that our advisors have with incoming students before they're choosing their classes for their first semester at TCU, because you're 100% correct. We don't want to do anything that's ultimately going to harm students.
Right.
Great point.
Great points about that. Well, with all of the things that are shifting, and I think we can all agree there's still some unknowns. I think there's even unknowns about, will we get back to school this year? Will we get back to school in the fall? What's going to happen? So 2 questions have come up that tie into one on my the list of questions as well. But with all that in mind, any thoughts in terms of shifting deadlines or anything changing in terms of that this fall to either accommodate later testing, like if the testing still is put off longer, which won't necessarily matter if it's test optional, but also in terms of, what else did you say? In terms of just extended time for students to visit. So those are actually kind of 2 different questions. Students visiting as seniors especially, that's more relative to right now in terms of deposit deadlines, May 1st, June 1st, those kinds of things. So maybe let's address that just quickly, first of all, and then since we have more juniors and younger folks in the group, is there any talk about down the road in the fall then in terms of application deadlines, any shifts that you've seen or been talking about at this point? So deposit deadlines first for current seniors, and then we'll go.
For the deposit deadline, we are sticking with May 1st at Davidson. And part of that was really thinking through all of the scenarios that go into this. I think COVID-19 has really put seniors and all students in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty, but we wanted to give them that time and leading up to May 1st for our admitted students to, if they make that decision, they know this is where they want to be. then that's one less thing they have to worry about throughout the remainder of the summer, or even if we extended another month. We wanted to give them that peace of mind that this part is solidified. So for this year, right now, we are sticking with May 1 for our deposit deadline. On the application deadlines, we have not discussed moving those back at the moment. I think for us, we are lucky we do have 3 deadlines to work with, 2 early decision deadlines, November 15th, then January 2nd. And that gives students a little bit more time that may have been on the cusp of deciding, do I want to apply early decision or regular decision? So they have that second opportunity, and our regular decision deadline of January 7th. So as we go further along into this process, that could change, but right now that's what we are sticking with at the moment.
Got it. Thank you. Heath or John, any other?
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about deadlines. I think that when it comes to our seniors, the students who've been admitted to the university, this is one of those cases where reasonable people, well-intentioned people can disagree. I fully understand and appreciate the position that Davidson has taken, and many other schools of maintaining May 1st. We had the same conversation and felt like we needed to extend the deadline for high school seniors, that by forcing them to make decisions under a normal time frame, we weren't relieving anxiety, we were adding anxiety to their shoulders at a time when, you know, families are by the millions on a weekly basis losing their jobs, and there's so much financial uncertainty. To ask them to put down money toward the cost of education at a private institution that is very expensive, we wanted to give them a little bit more time to have some understanding of what their financial future is going to be. Does an extra month do that? Maybe not, but maybe. And so we just felt like a little more flexibility would go a long way. So we've given students until June 1st to make their decision of whether or not they're going to enroll at TCU. And frankly, I think a lot of colleges, when it comes to May 1st, they're not going to have their classes in place, and they're going to be granting extensions, perhaps on a case-by-case basis, not en masse. Anyway, so we figured let's just go ahead and do it from the beginning, and continue to communicate with families, of course. They're still welcome to deposit by May 1st. We would gladly take their enrollment deposit, but a few extra weeks could really help. So we've built programming that goes not just through the end of April, but even into the month of May to help them learn a little bit more about TCU. As far as next year goes, we have not yet decided to push back any deadlines. Part of that is there are too many other things to think about right now, and the other piece is our early deadlines are November 1st, but we have a regular decision deadline that's February 1st. So even if a student hasn't had a chance to visit in September or October and can't get to us until November or December, they will still have a chance to apply to TCU and be given every opportunity to be admitted.
Okay.
So just to chime in terms of NC State, we are sticking with May 1st.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I still think that there's a lot of opportunity for flexibility around that for individual families that may need it. And then in terms of deadlines, we haven't discussed changing anything either. So we have a November 1st early action deadline, which we had actually changed last year from October 15th to the November 1st. And then January 15th for regular decisions. So as long, you know, and I think we're looking at it as long as school opens up in August and September, then things should be okay.
Right.
If that's not the case and there's a delayed opening, then it's an opportunity. Just like, you know, I had spent, 13 years in Massachusetts, and more than half of those years, there was some weather-related event that happened in October at any point across the country that required us to be flexible with that early deadline. I think that we're pretty adaptable to those kinds of things. Should there be some sort of delayed opening or anything else that could impact students being able to apply by our early deadlines.
That's great. Thank you. And I appreciate you saying that part that you just did too, John, that, and I said this when I was the lone speaker last week to my smaller group of attendees, that one thing I've learned in my professional career is that colleges have learned to adapt to many types of situations, natural disasters and other things that come up. This one just happens to be affecting all of us at the same time, which makes it more front of mind, obviously around the world, than just, you know, a tornado here or a hurricane there that is affecting a smaller part of the country. Touching on that, in that same vein of visiting and things like that, you know, the idea of demonstrated interest comes up a lot. And, you know, I have a lot of students who, for them, this is spring break and this was the week they were going to try to be on your campuses and others. And now when school starts, and Heath, especially in your case, you're farther away from us, those of us here in Charlotte at least. And so yeah, if demonstrated interest is something that a student is trying to do at this point and may not actually physically be able to get to campus, even with a February 1st deadline, depending on how busy their fall semester may be, how are you all considering that at this point, if that's a factor, and what else might you suggest that a student do right now?
Yeah, so I mean, there are actually a couple of questions embedded in there.
Yes.
And I think that we shouldn't gloss over the concept of demonstrated interest. And whether or not colleges use them and the degree to which that is factored in. We're one of those schools that will track a student's demonstrated interest, but we do it so that we can help students. In other words, if a student is really strong and we think that they're going to be a great addition to TCU, I wouldn't hold it against them if they haven't visited campus. And I'm not talking about during a pandemic. I mean, under normal conditions, right? So especially if you're coming from a great distance, I'm not going to make an assumption that you have the means to just get on an airplane and go visit 20 different colleges and disrupt your entire life to do that. So, you know, especially coming from the East Coast, where I think a lot of your families are, then, you know, I feel like it's my responsibility to admit you and then make the case that we should be a place that you consider, as opposed to the onus being on the student to sort of prove that they're worthy based on some magic demonstrated interest formula. But we do look at interest so that when we have a case where students are sort of borderline, but they really, really, really would love to be at TCU, then we're going to tip the scales in their favor, because part of what makes our community so great is that people want to be here. And it's an exciting campus to be on. Less exciting to be on a college campus when people would rather be somewhere else. So that's why we use interest to help students, but not hurt students. So I'll stop there because the Johns might have something to add about DI.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head there, because there's always going to be those instances, regardless of selectivity of an institution, where some students just can't get to the campus, even prior to a pandemic. And I think back to our committee meetings this year, and students that are applying from areas of California and just don't have the means to get to us, the correspondence that they have with their admissions counselor and just really engaging with them through the process, to us, that's a sign of demonstrated interest. We're getting to know them through the process. Now with the current situation, we've moved to a lot of virtual online opportunities for students to engage, from having current students actually lead virtual tours of our campus, just like we would if they were on campus. Multiple opportunities every week to engage with faculty members in different departments, as well as Q&A information sessions with folks like myself and other admissions staff members. And every time a student engages in that form, we're looking at it the same way as if they stepped foot on campus right now. And I have students that I work with in the Atlanta area that couldn't have gotten to us prior to this point, and they've communicated with me throughout the entire process. That, to me, and I'm a big stickler on tracking everything, as I'm sure you guys are. So every conversation I have with students, whether it's on the phone, by email, I'm putting that into their record so that even if I meet them as a sophomore, when it gets to their senior and they apply, I can look back and say, wow, we really had developed a good relationship for them to get to know Davidson, for me to get to know their capabilities. So it does play a role in the process. It's not a make or break for students, but I think demonstrated interest can be shown in many ways, and really taking advantage of what all schools are doing right now to engage with students, whether they're juniors, sophomores, or current seniors that are trying to make a decision. Take advantage of those virtual opportunities, whether it's a Zoom meeting or anything of that nature, because that's something that can at least help the students right now to get a feel for campus and if it's the right fit.
Great, thank you.
So we don't track demonstrated interest as part of the application process, but we do use Slate, which allows us to see a lot of that information. And so I got a report from one of my associate directors yesterday that just sort of looked at the initial point that the student entered our inquiry system. And the about 30% of our students, the first time we learned about them was when they either started a common or a coalition application. And so the stealth applicant, which, students have the ability to gather a lot more information electronically now than they ever have before. And so they don't necessarily have to join your mailing list. And so if you're working with students that don't want to join the mailing list, and that's entirely fine, I do think that following places on social media will help get them a little bit more of that information if they don't want to take that step of filling out the inquiry form or those kinds of things. I would agree with John and Heath in that all of us have upped our virtual games, so to speak, over the last month. And, looking at the volume of things that we've come up with to make sure that, one, students are able to make a good decision by May 1st, June 1st, whatever it might be, but also recognizing that March and April, for a lot of us, we, in a 6-week period, we would see 10,000 people between admitted students and high school juniors. And that's a lot of people on campus that we're trying to replicate or give some kind of indication of who we are. So I think that there's a lot of ways. I would encourage students to get on websites and see if there's individual colleges or departments that are also doing virtual things. There may be, beyond the virtual tour and information session, there's other things that colleges are doing as well. And again, if you're signing up for those things, whatever CRM, we're using, that's information that will get fed into that, and institutions will know that you are doing those things.
Great, thank you. We sort of touched on this in the beginning when we were talking about how other parts of the application will be used this year, maybe more than others, just to kind of gather other information about the students. So there's been some talk from the common application that they are going to add a standard question about how this pandemic has impacted you, so that students will have an opportunity, it sounds like, pretty easily to describe any disruptions in their education and their home life, those kinds of things in that space. I'm already then getting the follow-up questions or the questions, what if I want to write about this in my essay, which, we all know that there are topics that students are often told that you should avoid in this process. And I, for one, don't necessarily agree with that. I think students should write about what feels best to them. But I'd love to hear from you all who are reading far more than I am in a given year, and any thoughts on, should a student stay away from COVID-19 in their essays? Who wants to be first? John Sims, I'll call on you. No, go ahead. Whoever.
I'm happy to go. I don't think I personally just don't think it would be an issue for a student to write about how this has impacted them, because no one saw this coming. This is something, big experience for everyone, especially students that are in the college search process in high school, and it's going to impact everyone in different ways. So I think my advice would be, if a student does choose to write about how COVID-19 has impacted them, is to truly write about it from their perspective. Is the advice I always give on writing essays for the college application process, is to remember, don't try to write something that you think we want to hear. Because for us at Davidson, the application essays are a big part of our review. We really want to learn the student's story. But I always tell students, if you write about who you are, what experiences you have had, what has gotten you to where you are, that's an essay we have not read before. Mm-hmm. So whether it involves COVID-19 and the experience, As long as it's coming from the student's perspective, it's going to tell us more about their story for our holistic review. So I think it's truly up to the student, and just understand that we're more than happy to read those essays. We just want to truly know more about them as individuals, so we can use that information to try and predict, as he said earlier, if they will be successful academically at our institutions. That in the end, that's truly what the admissions review process is. We're trying to predict how you'll impact our campus, how well you will do, and that's not always a guarantee in anyone's admission process, but the more information we have about the student, the better.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think that there is such a thing as a taboo topic, really. I've never believed that, and I certainly don't believe that now. John made the point that we use the essay to try to get to know the student, and he's absolutely right. How could we possibly, on the one hand, say, we want to get to know you as deeply as possible, as much as you're willing to share with yourself about yourself, share with us about yourself. And then on the other hand, turn around and criticize them for choosing a topic that allows them to showcase who they are. That would be rather hypocritical of us. And I think there are colleges that or certainly individual admission officers who do that. They sort of get weary of reading the same thing, and it doesn't honor the student who has chosen to apply to the university. So we talk to our staff all the time about that, about trying to see the student in their space. We ask students to reveal something about themselves. Well, up until this point, there are a lot of things that a student could have chosen to write on, but this will certainly go down as one of the pivotal moments of their lives, of all of our lives, but we're not the ones who are applying to college right now. But if you're a 17-year-old trying to decide what has happened to me that has really shaped my human experience, this is going to resonate for a lot of those students. So they absolutely should write about it if they choose. Now, some students are going to take the opposite approach. They're going to say, you know what? I'm defined by so much more than COVID-19. I'd like to write on something else. And that's awesome. But if you as a student want to write about this and what this experience has been like for you, and what it's revealed about yourself and your character, by all means, you should do that. I would add that, like with any topic where we anticipate there's going to be some overlap between you and other students, that it means you have to do a really good job. That we want to see something that we haven't seen written before. But if you're heeding the advice that John gave about talking about it from your own perspective, I think you'll be able to do just that. So yeah, I wouldn't shy away from it at all.
We had already begun the discussion about next year's Common App and what questions we wanted to ask. And we have a couple of short answer questions that go beyond the regular essay question. And one is about obstacles and hardships that students have faced. And we immediately thought, well, we don't want everyone to answer that with their COVID-19 experience. And so we had already thought about adding an additional question about COVID-19, because those obstacles and hardships that students go through that they had gone through prior to March of 2020 and will continue to go through after this ordeal is over is important to us in the review process. But we also don't want to discount what experience they're going through individually right now and how that will play a role in who they are as a person. And I think John hit the nail right on the head. Talk to us about your individual experience and maybe what your experience was like. Oh, you know, most likely we're not going back to school this year for K through 12 students. And so what was that last quarter like for you? What was your family life like? What was your home life like? Maybe, you know, many of our students have part-time jobs that are in the service industry. What has that done to your experiences either continuing to work, and what does that mean to you, and what emotions and you know, do you have about getting in your car and going to Bojangles, you know, 3 days a week and serving, you know, drive-through? Or maybe, you know, you're in a service industry and you got laid off, and maybe that was an important part of, you know, you were helping with your family's finances, or maybe some more responsibility came upon you because you're going to be home now with younger siblings while parents were still working. All of those different kinds of things. We didn't want to discount or lose the obstacles and hardships that students see on a daily basis. We didn't want it to be, only limited to what they're going to experience over these, 8, 10, 12 weeks or however long this goes. So if you can do it, and like he said, do it well, I think we're going to be seeing those, and we're probably going to continue to see those kinds of essays for a little while. I don't know John as well, but Heath and I have known each other for 2 decades, and there was a significant period of time where we were reading lots of essays about 9/11, and both of us were from New York, and so these are some of those defining moments of essays that we'll continue to see for a while.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks for pointing out my age, John.
Yes, just because we've known each other a long time, we don't have to reveal how long. Tied into that, one of the questions that came up in the chat here, John Sims, you had mentioned that, things like counselor recommendations and teacher recommendations, in addition to the essays being important factors, especially without test scores being involved. And this is a timely question for students at large public schools in particular. So briefly, what are you looking for in the counselor recommendation? But obviously at large schools with either high counselor turnover or just oversized caseloads, there's some doubt about what's going to be included by those counselors in support of students. And so first, let's talk about what are you most looking for. And then if you have any tips for helping students even advocate for themselves, I certainly work with my students on that part of the process, but anything you all might add that they should be advocating for being included in those letters on their behalf.
Yes. So I think first off, we want to get the counselor, the teacher, and for our 4th recommendation, we also ask for a peer recommendation. So what we want to gather through these recommendations is, to me, it always comes down back to perspective. We want to know what that individual thinks of you, not just as a student, but also as a person. For the counselor recommendations, if you have a chance to engage in conversation, get to know your college counselor, that's great. We want that to drive home some of the themes that we're seeing in the application of the things you're passionate about, the things that you're involved in. But I always tell students, if you're at a school where your college counselors have a large caseload, first remember that they're doing a lot more than just being college counselors, as all of you are in this industry. So they're getting pulled in a lot of different directions. And I've always told students, schedule a time, now schedule a Zoom call if possible, or just time to connect with your college counselor. And if you don't know them well, just say, hey, these are the things I'm passionate about. I want you to get to know who I am, because when the time comes for me to submit my application, I'm going to be asking you for a recommendation. On the other hand, we also know it's pretty common for us to see, especially in the areas of students that I work with, face-to-face or through Zoom, is that we do ask through the Common Application or other application entities that we use, if the counselor does not feel they can write a strong recommendation for the student because they haven't gotten to know them well, we do ask for them to inform us of that on the recommendation, the school report form. And on that, they'll typically say, I think you should focus on the recommendations from the teachers because they'll be able to give more insight. And it's never looked at negatively in our process. If we see that, we understand that counselor has a large caseload. It just has not been possible for them to get to know that student. And the teacher recommendations really drive home great information about how that student has engaged in classes, what they've added to class discussions, their passion for certain areas of academics. And then I think the real benefit is having that peer recommendation portion. We're getting an adult's perspective of who the student is, then someone's perspective who's around the same age range, because a year from that point when they apply, they're going to be in college. So most likely what their peers think of them at that point is going to be somewhat similar to what they're going to think of them a year from that point. So we're getting a lot of good information from these recommendations. So I would definitely say if the student hasn't had a chance to get to know their counselor, reach out, show that you really want to make that effort to get to do so. But also you can let us know, or we'll connect with the counselor if that chance just hasn't been able to happen. And we'll focus on the other recommendations in the process.
John gave great advice. The only thing I would add to that is this question really resonates with me because I graduated a million years ago, apparently, from a,
Dark age.
yeah, from a large public high school. I had 600 people in my graduating class, and I didn't know my counselor all that well. I think she knew my name. And so I asked another school administrator to write a letter of recommendation in addition to the counselor. So if there's another adult in the community who you feel like could really help explain what your role is at your school or in the larger community, we wouldn't be opposed to seeing a letter from that person as well.
Great. Thank you. Well, this one we may not be able to finish in the amount of time we have left, but there are a couple of questions that are along the lines of, what if school doesn't return to normal in the fall? What if we have an abbreviated year next year for some reason, whether we start October later, something like that? The first question is just a general, how will those senior year grades be viewed, or that year's grades be viewed if that were to happen? And then, because not all schools are doing online learning so successfully, we should say, there are some folks, one in particular, who has asked, she's considering pulling her student out completely and going to a dedicated online school, because just if they know what they're doing there, that would make more sense. But with other disruptions like that, whether it's self-imposed, you choose to do it and move to an online learning situation, or if we are just in a situation where school is not resuming in late August, early September, like we would have thought, any other caveats you would add about, how does that look? How does that impact a process in light of what's going on in the world, at least right now?
I think I can speak for Davidson on that front. We are planning for every potential outcome right now. So we have not made any final decisions, because we're literally looking at if everything goes as planned and school can start on time, we'll continue with the current process. If there's a delay, here's going to be our response. And then if students cannot go back to school for the entire fall, here's what we're going to do. So we haven't made any formal decisions. We are in discussions because for that process, if we make any changes to our overall review past what we've done thus far, we do have to include senior leadership and faculty members that are on the Faculty Admissions Committee in those discussions. But I think one thing to note is kind of the theme that I've noticed from all of our responses today. We want to work with the students and meet them where they are, and just understanding that if that does happen, it's not going to be at their disadvantage because it was not their fault. They did not choose to not be able to start school or to not be able to go back to school fully, or were forced into a fully online opportunity. So we'll be prepared for that. We're going to have a decision on all these potential outcomes by the end of this month is our goal. But I think the key thing to just remember is that regardless of what happens, the institutions should and will be willing to work with students where they are. Don't fear things that are out of your control, but it's our responsibility, and I've always felt this way my entire career, that our job is to work with the students, regardless of what the situation is, and try to do whatever we can once we get them to our institution to make them successful, find their academic passion, and put them on to bigger and better things when they leave. So if this year ends up being an anomaly of how we have to do that, we will find a way to do that and be there for the students.
The one thing I would add to that is that might be the sole reason why you sign up for a school's mailing list. If you haven't figured it out over the last hour, the way Davidson, TCU, and NC State runs their process and does things is all very different. And even throughout the UNC system, we don't all act in the same way. And so we may react differently to different situations. And so if there's a change in a deadline, being part of the mailing list is a way to at least find that information out without necessarily having to go to every single website and dig to find that kind of information. Or again, if you're following us on social media, I think every time we send an email out, something similar goes out either through Twitter or Facebook or any of those other social media things that I'm too old to do at this point.
John, they use TikTok now. That's what you got to go with.
My 13-year-old's on that, and I just assume it's good for the kids these days, right? But like John said, if we have to make adjustments, I think we're fully prepared to do that. And again, we don't want to disadvantage the student in the process at any point. So.
Well, Heath, any final thoughts? I also know we are very close to the end of the hour, and we want to be sure we all get to our next meetings that we might have.
No, they did a great job. They summed it up perfectly.
Well, and I just want to say thank you to you three again. There are still unanswered questions. I may impose on your kindness and send you some emails to see if you would be kind enough to follow up, that I could then share some of these answers to the participants whose questions I didn't get to this morning. Again, in gratitude, be well, stay healthy. To my participants out there, stay in touch. I will get you the answers to these last questions, and these conversations will continue until we get through this, because I think sharing the information is what helps us remain calm. And if we're informed, we can relax a little bit, hopefully, in this process. And I hope that you all learned that these guys are trustworthy, and we're all going to try to work together to make this the best process for your students that we can. So thank you. Everybody stay healthy, and I'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
See ya.